I'm watching this show called The Last Kingdom. It is about the conflict around land and religion between 9th century Christians and Vikings. And so there's this scene, and they're sometimes trying to coexist with each other, but it doesn't go well, and there's a lot of wars that happen. So there's this one scene where there's a couple of people who are Christian and a couple of people who are Viking. And one of the Christian priests says something about accepting baptism as a way to connect to the one God, because this is the 9th century. So the Viking man says, "What's baptism?" And so another person explains, "Oh, they put you in some water, they pour more water over you, and they say some words." And then the Viking man says, "So they want me to have a bath?" And it's a small scene, but to me, it speaks volumes to our present state. And so we have these things in the world, or relationships, or places even, where some of us consider them sacred and holy, and others couldn't care less. Either they scorn it or it's mundane. And so we're at this little war almost, or it feels opposite, that which is sacred and that which is scorned or unholy or just usual, mundane. And that's so present now in every area of life, right? We have land and environment that is so sacred to so many people, to so many cultures of the world, or whatever a person's lifestyle is like. And then there's a whackload of people on the planet that see land and water as things for them to use. There isn't a loving or active relationship with it. There's relationships in themselves. We consider mother, father, child. Some of us consider it to be really holy and really sacred, and other people consider it to be, whatever. I had a child, I didn't want one. And there's like in every area of life, right? It hits us with our bodies even. There's people who consider their bodies temples, and they're really careful with what they eat, and they work out, and they take deep breaths, and they do all the lovely practices. And then there's people that eat tons of junk food, and they smoke, and they do things that are continually, maybe not great for them. There's so many people who find out they have an ailment, but liver disease, but they don't stop drinking, for example. And I think the focus right now, and it has been for a really long time, is to judge these opposite actions to judge them as good and not good, right? So you come into this, you judge something as good and not good, and then we attribute additional weight to that. And it is a difficult feeling to hold something so holy, so personal, so sacred, so loving, and to have someone else disregard it, to have it mean so little to someone else. It's so upsetting. But this gap that pains us, I think there's so much more to it now. And there possibly always was, but personally or collectively, maybe it wasn't safe, or we hadn't been in a space to really acknowledge it. So if you think about, the divide or the separation between my God, my religion, my practices, and yours, my body, my choice, my sex, my gender, my life choices, my work choices, and yours, my politics, and yours. If there's a division, if there's a divide, it's almost like the only way we know how to address a division or a divide is to fight, right? For the most part, especially in collective consciousness, that's what we see. We also see it on social media, someone has an opinion and everyone goes off and hates it. If they're very vocal about, hating it and putting it down. We also, oftentimes, if we, I noticed this with, in my life, like with friendships or with coworkers, I thought that when I started on a spiritual path, I would make all my coworkers, I don't know, become more spiritual or, get more attuned to their bodies. And I didn't realize this at the time, but every time I spoke to them, it was almost like I was constantly trying to subtly change their perspective in some way. It came from a place of non-acceptance. And so this is where I think that gap we have between what is scorned and what is sacred is actually a huge teacher. And it is teaching us to enter into a depth and a breadth of acceptance within ourselves and within our world that we haven't really even begun to conceptualize. And it feels to me like really early stages, or at least it's very early stages for me. So when we're fighting with each other, or we're trying to convince each other, or we're trying to change each other's mind, we effort a lot of energy into what is different. And I think that comes from us being so patterned into separation. So for those folks who, follow religious or spiritual paths that really align with who they are, or folks who delve into, psychedelics, we've all had experiences of oneness, where the world, everything that separates us from each other, from the plants, from the animals, from the elements, melts away. And in those in those moments that are timeless, we know oneness. And then we return into our bodies, and then we have to go to work, and then we have to have, a weekday and a weekend. And then the natural separation of our world kind of moves back in. But if you've ever had the experience of unity consciousness, of this oneness, you are familiar with, or of what I speak. And so so oneness in a way is the opposite of separation. So we exist in separation, and that's sort of where I believe this separation between what is sacred and what is scorned or mundane exists. It's because it's teaching us the allness. It's sort of like if you delve into aspects of divine feminine from any tradition, in pagan traditions, in Vedantic cultures, even early Christianity, if you find some of the work that comes from the feminine line, and this is feminine energy, not just about women, it is all about returning to that ocean of consciousness, returning to the soil where everything exists. And I think that is the lesson, that is the medicine that we are all coming to learn. And it feels largely unconscious, but we're coming to that. Not everyone, but those of us who feel this, that's sort of, I think, what we're feeling. And how it's being expressed is that we're feeling this bigger and bigger pulling apart of what we hold to be really valuable, and that we hold in perhaps high esteem, and having all these other people perceive the opposite or speak the opposite. And it aggravates us, it angers us, it upsets us, and we upset them. But I think we are learning acceptance at a whole new dimension. So what if the best thing for me to do in the moment is to have a view opposing to yours when we're talking about something? Right? We have this idea or this goal. A lot of us crave like-minded communities, but think about that for a second. Is that what we truly want? Do we want this echo chamber where everyone's exactly the same as one another? Isn't that what there's there's a group of aliens in the Star Trek Next Generation and Star Trek Voyager called the Borg, and they are assimilated hive mind consciousness. And they all do the same thing. They get assimilated and they just all do the same thing, whatever the queen wants. And, you know, is that the highest expression of humanity? I think not. And hey, maybe you disagree with me. That's awesome. But for me, that isn't it. For me, we are different in every way, in so many ways, because we are meant to be different. We are meant to be these unique expressions of oneness consciousness that are very different and have these different expressions, different opinions, different everything. And then through those differences, we are meant to return to the ocean of consciousness. That's the life journey. And so I really love this Sufi quote by Rumi. And it goes something like, the truth was a mirror that was held by God. It fell and broke into many pieces. Everyone went and took a piece. They held it, they looked at it, and they believed they had the truth. But what's important here in our time is our individual expressions of our own inner truth. And I'm not talking about what we believe to be true or what our mind is interested in from a place of attachment, but what our actual soul truth expression is. That is going to be similar and different to people we encounter. But what if the work here is to love that difference? So the next time you're talking to someone about whatever, the weather, politics, what you are doing this weekend, and if they disagree with you or they have a different opinion, what if, for fun, what if within ourselves we go, wow, thank you for expressing your difference. And we start to allow differences in ourselves, in each other, and I don't know, see what happens. What if the most curious and fun thing is that someone is different? You know, what happens when we bump into each other's, so what happens now, I guess, when we bump into each other's edges, like the show The Last Kingdom I'm watching, where like there's these people have a land and these people have a land, and then they're trying to get more land, and then they bump into each other, and then a massive war happens, and then 15 other wars happen. And every time there's a war, everyone is convinced that this is the Great War. And it's like 15 wars later, we're back at the same thing, right? So we have been bumping into each other's boundaries, and we've been like, oh my God, war. And so we do that to each other. You know, maybe we're not poking swords at each other these days, but we're quite cruel to each other on social media, or when it comes to opinions and things like that, or, you know, around awkward family dinners, we tend to fight. So imagine if we started to thank people for their differences. And maybe this sounds really wild and crazy, and like I have no idea myself, to be completely honest. But what if we become grateful for the different expression, the different texture, the different way of unfolding for another person, because they are different. They did not have our set of experiences. They are not in our body. They do not have our mind and our consciousness. Why would we expect them to love the same things we love with the same intensity and the same expression? Doesn't it take all the flowers to make a garden? Doesn't it take every species doing whatever it is that they do and expressing their life force in their own unique way to make a forest healthy and vibrant? We accept it in the natural world, we accept it in the wild, but somehow this idea that when we domesticate or civilize ourselves, we're supposed to become echo chambers of each other. We're supposed to all become the same thing. It's some version of George Orwell's 1984 where everyone speaks the same, everyone does the same thing. So you know what? Maybe we still fight. Maybe we still have arguments. But maybe what we are learning is to hold discourse with each other, fully acknowledging that we are not only different beings and people, but we are also here to move through experiences in different ways. I was reading a story. It was written by a man who is from an Indigenous First Nations here. So the history, if you're unfamiliar with many First Nations here in different parts of North America, is that when people were children, they were taken away from their parents, away from their tribes and their nations. They were put into these places, institutions called residential schools. For the most part, an inordinate amount of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse took place. Eventually, I think around the 60s, a lot, or if not all, the residential schools closed down. And then you had this group of people that were now sort of snatched from their home, didn't speak the language of their parents or their grandparents, didn't really have a lot of connection to their culture, had inordinate amount of abuse, and they were sort of just unleashed onto society. And we continually become very shocked as to why there's so many social problems, that came from this treatment. And so the story I was reading was about one such person. He was, I think, a little older when he was put into residential school, experienced vile trauma that no human should experience, let alone a child. And so then when he, left, he had a really rough life. He experienced a lot of continual trauma. There was alcohol abuse. There was just a lot of stuff that he went through while he was trying to find out who he was and find roots and belong somewhere. And he speaks about himself as very, very blessed, very lucky, because it ended up that he did find help, and he was able to resolve a lot of his trauma and, find roots and find people to help him, except around education. So for a long time, even after a lot of his like sexual and physical trauma healed, he could not reconcile why anyone sent their children to school. Because from his perspective, he had come from obviously this very traumatized perspective, but the way he explained it, in many Native cultures, learning and education is as much a part of life for adults as it is for children. There's no separation. There's no, I'm going to go to work, you're going to go to school, we're going to do our little thing, and then we're going to come back home. That, I guess, in history, that didn't exist. Children learned by simply being around adults. They learned, what plants were medicine. They learned how to hunt. They learned how to take care of themselves. They learned how to connect to great spirit and great mystery. They learned all of their creation stories and their myths through life experience. He explained it as an experiential way of learning and existence, because their lifestyle and their culture was very different than Western thought. And so, and add to that his experience at residential school. So he could not fathom why anyone would willingly send their children to an institution for someone else to teach, and then that child would return home at the end of the day, and the adult would have no connection to what was taught and learned. That was mind-blowing to him. And so he explains how he resisted it for a really long time, and he thought it was like everyone was crazy for sending their kids to school, right? Like such a specific experience. Now, to me, he is not wrong. But people who value education, who like love going to school, or, feel a lot of pride sending their kids to school, they experience it as sacred, whereas he thought it was the craziest thing ever. Eventually, he did get to sit with it and sort it through his life. And I think eventually in his 40s or 50s, he actually enrolled in university. And like he went back for like higher education. And in that way, he came to resolution. But for years, he wasn't in that place. And so, it's this funny thing. Now, if we just met him randomly at a party or at a dinner table, his views, we wouldn't essentially know all of his history. We don't know everyone's history. but there are reasons people believe or do not believe in certain things. And I think what this dynamic between the sacred and the scorned, as I like to call it, is that we are within the self. We are acknowledging that diversity not just exists, but it is actually the thing that makes us better, stronger, more accepting, more loving, more compassionate. It's like our edges push and expand from within, like the Earth's tectonic plates. Like they're shifting, they are going to bump against each other. Mine will bump against yours, yours will bump against mine. But now we are learning other ways to hold discourse through our differences. And I think that is such a gift of disagreeing with someone. It's actually so much more a blessing than agreeing with them. Obviously, there's an ease and a joy and a delight when you meet someone who has similar views or watches similar shows and movies. But I think the true joy, the growth, the unfolding and reforming of our edges comes from this deep acceptance that what I hold to be so, amazing, blessed, honest, honorable, you do not. And wow, what do we do with that? And the goal isn't for me to change your mind or you to change mine. I think the goal here is to accept. And to accept at levels and layers that hasn't really ever been encouraged, hasn't even been safe. I learned to debate in school. So you find all the points of the other person and then you systematically, break them down. But what if we're taught differently? What if we're taught to be wow, you are so different. That is the most incredible thing ever. And for a few moments before we say anything to each other at all, to hold in wonderment that whatever set of experiences, thoughts, other people have impacted and influenced who you are, the snapshot version of you is meeting the snapshot version of me in this moment. It's really a curious thing. There's this way of farming in native or in a lot of ancient cultures. I know the native one. It's called Three Sisters, and the three sisters are corn, beans, and squash. And when you cross plant them, timing is of essence, obviously, but when you cross plant them, you nourish the soil in a way that it doesn't need to be left fallow for a few years after. What one plant gives off, the other plants take. And the system of planting corn, beans, and squash together hinder pests and bugs and nourishes not only the soil, but the plants. But it's like these three very diverse species of plants strengthen the soil, strengthen each other, and they come into support in a very different way than monoculture. So corns are long and long, tall, and right, they kind of stick out like that. Beans sort of are viney, they wrap around, and then squash just kind of grows on the ground, right? So the diversity here is not only what gives support and health and vibrance, but also protection. And it supports added flavor. It's actually common in the fall to have Three Sisters soup or stew, at least where I live. And so I'm really thrilled by this, even though I haven't fully understood it myself. But it's almost like this is the difference between that Piscean age that we have left behind and this new age of Aquarius that we are walking in. Because in the Piscean age, there was difference, and we were just trying to sort ourselves and each other out. And we didn't know where we were. We didn't know where each other was. So we just kind of bang into each other and figure it out. I mean, it wasn't all bad, but that seemed to be the way, right? Or that seemed to be our experience of the way. But in the age of Aquarius, I think we are learning to honor the darkness because because we are light, and it is in the darkness that we shine, like stars in the night sky. They're still there in the daytime, but we just can't see them because the sun is brighter and very strong, or there's clouds. I think what we're also learning is to stand in our own creative expression of self, right? We are standing with that Rumi quote from earlier, right? For me to stand with my piece of the mirror, and for you to stand with your piece of the mirror, and for us to be like, oh, wow, they're so different. I wonder if they go together. And if they don't, that's no problem. We'll chat with some other people and see if more pieces can go together, because we know that there's a larger mirror, and maybe the common goal is that, but how we get there, totally different. Maybe we still fight, and maybe we still war. That's one expression. And maybe we make some friends. Maybe some of us are little connectors. Maybe another one stands on a soapbox and it's like, this one's mine. Who's got a matching piece? Now, there are all these different expressions of how we do it, how we exist in our own process, how we show up in a different way. And I think that's all available to us right now if we learn to first accept the self exactly how it is in the moment. And that means accepting the parts of us that are hurt, the parts of us that are frustrated, not by denying them or ignoring them, but really coming into ownership that we exist and we feel this way. This is not about blaming ourselves or blaming a person from our past or a person in our present. It's not about blaming other aspects of life, other, organizations or countries or whatever it is that we like to blame. The level of ownership required of the self now, that then opens up to us standing not only in the strength of ourselves, but standing in acceptance and humility of others, is next level. And I'm really feeling this today. And like I said, no idea what it means beyond, everything that I've shared, but I want to end with this instead of an invitation. I want to thank you for who you are, for the life experiences that made you who you are. But most importantly, I want to thank you for having the courage to being different than me, different than your neighbors and your family members, different perhaps than anyone else you know. And if you are similar to them, that is awesome too. And if you're different, that is now a whole new level and layer of awesome, because we learn so much more consciously and unconsciously from experiences that are different. I will leave you with that today. Have a great day.